Welcome to the Academy for Leadership in Teacher Education International Webinar Series for Exemplary Scholarship. We are honored to have Professor Yong Zhao of the School of Education at the University of Kansas, USA, and Melbourne Graduate School of Education at University of Melbourne, Australia with us today to deliver a lecture titled Reach for Greatness, Personalisable Education for All. Today's lecture is organized by the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. My name is Crystal and I'm the MC of today. Before we start, I would like to introduce some house rules. First of all, in order to avoid unnecessary noise throughout the session, we have muted all of you and your cameras are turned off as the default setting. This lecture is also broadcast live from our faculty Facebook page and YouTube channel. It will also be recorded for uploading onto different faculty online platforms after the lecture as well. The Q&A session is exclusive for participants who have registered for this webinar. In this session, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can help you ask the questions. The raise hand function will not be responded. For the rundown, Professor Zhao will deliver the lecture for around an hour. After that, there will be around 30 minutes for the Q&A session. Now, may I invite Professor Aileen Goodwin, Dean of Faculty of Education, to give a welcome remarks. Professor Goodwin, please.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to my, what time is it over there now? It's sort of early evening, about 6 o'clock?
6:30.
6:30. So good evening to Professor Yong Zhao, who is joining us today and is our invited speaker for this ALiTE series. I would like to just give you a brief bio and then just add a couple of comments from my own knowledge of Professor Zhao and the work that we've done together. So Professor Yong Zhao is a Foundation Distinguished Professor in the School of Education at the University of Kansas in the US. And he is also a professor in educational leadership at Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Although currently he is in Oregon. So in these days of COVID, we can be sort of many places simultaneously. He previously served as the presidential chair and director of the Institute for Global and Online Education in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, where he was also a professor in the Department of Educational Measurement, Policy, and Leadership. Prior to that, he was University Distinguished Professor at the College of Education at Michigan State University, where he also served as the founding director for the Center for Teaching and Technology, executive director of the Confucius Institute, as well as the U.S.-China Center for Research on Educational Excellence. So as you can tell, first the word distinguished is usually attached to Professor Yong Zhao's name. He has held many distinguished positions and has done a lot of groundbreaking work in many places in the world. Professor Zhao's work focuses on the implications of globalization and technology on education, particularly relevant during these days and times. He has published well over 100 articles and 30 books, including Counting What Counts, Reframing Education Outcomes, Never Send a Human to Do a Machine's Job, Correcting Top 5 EdTech Mistakes, love that title. Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China has the best and parens and worst education system in the world. Catching Up or Leading the Way, American Education in the Age of Globalization. And World-Class Learners, Educating Creative and Entrepreneurial Students. You can certainly visit his website for more information, and you will always find that Professor Zhao will provoke you. He will cause you to question. He will present things from an angle and perspective that you did not consider before, and he will really, engage you in some deep thinking. That is why I'm so delighted that he is here today. And a couple of things I'd like to add to this illustrious bio is that Professor Zhao is one of the conveners, and I think one of the original instigators and imaginers of the Global Education Deans Forum that started 3 years ago now, I think, and brings together about 40 deans from top research intensive schools of education around the world. Unfortunately, this year we had to meet online, but it has been a really invigorating and intellectual group. The other thing that you'll want to pay attention to is his work in Silver Lining for Learning, which is a weekly webinar series that looks at current issues and engages in conversation with sort of thought leaders, practitioners, researchers from around the world, looking at education and reimagining it, given, in some sense, the crisis, and in other sense, the opportunity that the pandemic has presented. So, Yong, so lovely to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin. As you know, how much I admire your work, as well as the work of the University of Hong Kong. I wish I could be there to interact with all the audience, with you more fully. And unfortunately, we're not able to do that. As I was talking to you, during COVID, I want to invite actually all of the audience to think about our interactions. On the one hand, we're interacting with more people. On the other hand, all the interactions quality has dropped. So what would you like to do? What would you not like to do? And today I'm so fortunate and so honored to have the chance to share with you my thoughts, my reasoning, what I've been thinking about in education. And really the main thing, I have this title. This title came up from a book I wrote 2 years ago. It's really from a big reflection of my life. I've used to pursue how to use technology to improve education, how globalization can improve education. But really, after so many years, after you examine all the education reforms, education really has not moved much. That's the first thing. That is, I was examining the US data, NAEP data. I was examining the international data, PISA and TIMSS. And I was examining the Australia data and NAPLAN data, all this big set of data. You don't see education move massively over the last 30 years. I cannot say 50, but 30 years. The idea of equity has not solved either. That's groups of students, the gap still remains. The average scores still remains. Why is that? Now think about that. Hong Kong has done a lot of education reforms. We've done a lot of educational research. We've been training our teachers. But honestly, if we ask ourselves, how has education changed over the last 30 years that has truly made education quality go up? Just look at the basic indicators. The basic data we collect are of reading and math. I have not seen massive changes. So what is the issue? We've touched all the reforms, changes, have touched all the core things in education. We've changed curriculum. We've changed teachers. We've forced them to be more accountable. We've changed our assessments. We've played with a lot of things. The only thing that we have not touched are students. Our schools have been strengthened, but our students, their learning haven't changed. We have not involved our students as learners. So that's why today I'm going to really talk a little bit about that. So the first thing I want to say is, what's the biggest problem in our schools? The biggest problem in our schools are children. Without children, our schools would be perfect. Without kids, it would be perfect. And the children are our biggest problem. Why? Why is that? So let's think about that. See if we have, that's the book I wrote, and that's was going to, about 2 years ago. So you have children. Now, when you look at a child like this, we have two different approaches to look at this child. One is that you immediately began to dream, what will this child become? As parents, as teachers, I want this person to be a lawyer, to be an accountant, to be a doctor, to be whatever you like. That's one model. So if you want that person to be like that, engineer, what do? You begin to think about what should this person learn? What knowledge, what skills, what school you want to go? So that's what I call a very authoritarian approach to say, what would they want to, what I want you to be. Another approach is that, what does this child have? We don't know, it's a he or a she, we don't know. So what if we follow the child? So the children have become the problems because, number one, this child has intention. This child is a natural learner. This child with others are diverse learners. So we have children who are very different. So that's our biggest problem, because schools want them to be different. So let me explain a little bit how our children are natural born learners. Remember, human beings are quite unlike some other animals. What we have is something called creativity, or some people would call that the ability to learn. The ability to learn is really creativity. It is what you think. You can use your talent to address the unknown problems, the uncertainties. That's the key to learn. That's the key to how we learn new things. We have the capacity. So every human being is a natural born learner. Number two, we are very diverse learners. Students are very different in that regard. And number three, students are very intentional learners. We are born into a lot of different things, but we focus on things that matter. So that becomes the problem to our schools. Because if you look at it in human learning, we're basically dealing with what you're born with and what your experience is. We used to debate. Think about John Dewey and B.F. Skinner. They would be debating about, the psychologist say, okay, I can teach you everything, or are you born with everything? That's why today we have really two different groups. In education, we'd like to think we can teach you anything. And I believe that too, but not really. And at the same time, we have a lot of psychologists kept talking about, your personality matters, what you're born matters, IQ matters. That's what I call it, how smart you are, we go to IQ. So you measure something, hopefully it's going to drive your life. This book is not necessarily the best book for this idea, but it's one of the first ones to really give a very good explanation to say, nature, that is what you are born with, is expressed or suppressed by nurture. So, for example, if you're born to be 1.7 meters high, if you don't have enough food as part of the experience, you probably won't be 1.7 meters high. But if you're born to be 1.7 meters, no matter how much food you eat, you won't become 1.9 meters. So that's the basic idea. So you're constrained by what you are born with. You are also supported by that. And this matters a lot in our teaching and learning today. Before, it did not really matter because we want individuals just to be good enough or mediocre, not to be great, because our old society did not demand that. But today it actually matters. So on the one hand, for example, you say, well, we can learn anything. I can teach you anything. Yes, you can teach anyone to be able to paint. You can really teach everyone to be paint, but not everyone can become a Picasso. So that's the thing. No. Yes, you can teach anything, but do you think you should be teaching anyone anything? Because we have nature as the controlling aspect of it. Human nurture changes too. So that's why we have, I'm just going to run this quickly through. Many of you are familiar with Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, which is, I don't agree with how he labeled everything, because he basically labeled based on what we know. Human beings actually are diverse in many different ways. This is how diverse we can be. And also, these are not learning styles. Don't get that wrong. These are your intelligence. That, for example, some people are actually born with the eyesight that's a better decipher color patterns. That means you're more likely to be a visual artist. Some of you have more sensitive ears. I know some of you are more sensitive to sound, to different levels. That gives you a chance to become artist. However, none of this would matter if you're born into an environment where you don't have any opportunity. I thought I could have become a Justin Bieber in China, but never had the chance. I was born in a little village in China, no access to music. So there's no way I could even know I was good or bad at music. That's why, early years, triggering your children's talent in a domain is extremely important, triggering that. But of course, you need time to change this. But let's just stop thinking about this. Is the cognitively, we are born with a diversity of talents. Also, personality-wise, if you go through the personality literature, human children are 2 to 3 year olds, their personality is already shaped to certain degrees. You run into people, some people are extremely quiet, withdrawing, they're not assertive, but others are quite outgoing and energetic and gregarious. You know that. In life, actually, people are different. They have different personalities. And that personalities can be suppressed, of course. As I said, education is the same way. Even if you are, really, tone deaf, I can still teach you to sing. Not very good, but I can teach you to sing. The same thing with the personality. I can suppress you. In a culture, it's okay. I can force more outgoing, more energetic, but it's better for you to be quieter. If you can pretend to do certain things. So remember, this is that's the part of this. And of course, we are also know this is from Stephen Rice from Ohio State, who had passed away already. Talks a lot about the human basic desires. This is the driving things. What do you want? What drives you to do certain things? There are 16 basic desires. Somebody pursues power. Their reign, power, influencing others is most important to them. J. Edgar Hoover, Donald Trump, they are type of those, and they are driven maybe 90% of their motivation is by power. That's why you say Trump still hasn't conceded. He wants to influence, he wants to be the boss. Then you have other people who may be curiosity. The paparazzis, the scientists, all of those are driven by curiosity. So Trump is just the opposite. Trump is driven only by power, but has no curiosity. He doesn't want to know anything, doesn't want to learn anything. This is it's interesting. But there's a lot of people driven by curiosity. Some are driven by saving things, others driven by honor. So those are the natural born differences we know of so far. Diverse, different. Everybody is different personality, different cognitive style, and different desires. Then if you add to our diverse experiences, where are you born with? What schools do you go to? What do we value? This is actually a very interesting example. If you look at Hong Kong, Hong Kong has been very diverse. Hong Kong used to be the suppliers of music, dancing, new art for mainland China. And during the end of Cultural Revolution, because the whole culture did not support all the dancing, all the art, all the music, all the creativity, a lot of those talents were suppressed. Were not. But today, after the reform and open door policy, China is on the rise. Hong Kong still plays a role, but the role has been declining. China has 1.4 billion people. By accident, you would have more talents in those domains. They're just waiting for the opportunities and experiences and schools to thrive. So what do you want to give your children when, as a family, as a community, when they come to school? Our children, they are drastically different. Now in our schools, so our problem is that, why are those problems? We have people like this. They have a jagged profile of talent. Every person has a jagged profile of talent. That is, you're going to be tall, you're going to be short, you're going to have a bigger stomach or shorter stomach. So every human being, I'm looking at the Professor Lynn Goodwin here, she has a jagged profile. She has her own interest, her own strength, her own passions, her own experience. It makes a different person. Now, but what do schools want? Schools want this. When you come to school, we have schooling. Schools have an outcome that's been outlined in all the government documents called curriculum. In a curriculum or learning profile, we want students to be able to do this, this, and this. So what do? You suppress that. And this is why with the international tests like PISA, like TIMSS, like also all the international testing, you have a problem. You want children to be the same. Societies that suppress better get better international test scores. That's, it's really, you look at mainland China, look at the Korea, Japan, most East Asian education systems, including Hong Kong and Singapore, have traditionally produced higher test scores because we suppress better. And, people used to say, oh, the US has teach education or creativity better. US doesn't teach creativity any better. We just don't kill it as successfully. We have a broader system. We don't kill it. I don't have time to explain that, but we have a broader field. So in this way, school try to make everybody the same, but they're not the same. So that's why our first problem in schools with the kids is they are different. We want to homogenize them, but they're different. This is why the so-called achievement gaps. There are people behind, there are people forward. You look at all our schools, we spend lots of time dealing with this issue of diversity. We try to divide them into gifted and talented students, special education students, left behind students. We try to deal with them, put them into smaller groups. We do discrimination. We have all those plans to do this. We keep them, retain them for grade. All of this are trying to suppress humanity, suppress human nature, which was very necessary because for a long time, human society indeed required a massive number of people with similar skills and knowledge, not at a high level. If you go work for Henry Ford, you don't need Lady Gaga. Okay, Lady Gaga is useless for Henry Ford because Ford doesn't need any of those. Think about those big factories, which Hong Kong kind of outsourced back to China in the 1990s and 1980s. Is there? So that's where our trouble. Second trouble with students is that students are intentional, but we want students to move at the same speed. If you look at our schools, we're still organized by age. We know no matter how you organize, an age is still 1 year of difference. So you can chop the age by September to August or December to next November. It's still 1 year of gap. But even with that, we want to move them forward. I was joking with people, I said, have you thought about the idea of throwing birds? Imagine you have a dead bird. You throw the dead bird into the air, you can practically predict the trajectory, where the bird would lie. But if you are throwing a live bird, the live bird works. The live bird will disrupt your plan. That's what our children are. Our children are intentional individuals. I know in Hong Kong, East Asia, I'm from China. If you force them hard enough, children might follow you better. But at the same time, they give up something else. So in this regard, I've laid out the first thing that human nature is intentional, natural born, diverse learners, and intentional learners. That's what we have. When children come to school like this, our traditional education is trying to fight against that. And then we have a curriculum to compress them, which have not been very successful, globally speaking. They want to think about, this is what I learned about 10 years ago. I wrote all this in my book to say what we did wrong. So that's the time when I began to debate about education. Then I want to come to another point I want to make about education. What creates a good education? You probably know all this 2009 PISA results is very much like the same 2019 results. So I did not even update. It's about the same. You know, where's America? America is nowhere. So one of the things people say, okay, America needs education reform. Lots of people saying this because American education is getting worse, is going bad. I said, no, American education is not getting worse, it's not going bad. It has always been bad. American education has been bad in terms of test scores for a long time. If you look at this data, this is the US data. From the 1960s, first international mathematics study, Americans 12th graders ranked 12th out of 12 countries. And that was pretty bad. If you know math, that's very bad. And if you go on, America's never been really good. But now you want to say, if it had really been that bad, the US should not even exist anymore. Let alone the US still manufactures some of most of the innovations come from the US. The countries has been moving forward. Trump has messed up America, but still the country is moving forward. It's amazing. It's always like, how did that happen? But what happens to education? Did education matter that much? Or what does it mean? So I've been looking at the question from that book. So why is America still here? So I've been looking at some data. And remember that this model, okay, trying to change that. So I look at some of the international data. If you look at the TIMSS, the trends in international mathematics and science study, it shows something really interesting. The Asian countries, East Asian countries, Hong Kong, Singapore, the test scores are way above the USA. But if you look at the student surveys, one of them is about confidence. Do you believe you can do this subject? Do you think you're good at this? Then you found something really interesting. American students, they're really bad, but they feel very good. So this is the shocking part, So I may be wrong, but that's how I feel. I'm feeling confident. I'm feeling very good about this. Then if you go through the data, you will find out the same thing. 2011 data. If you look at all the Asian countries score so much higher than the Anglo-Saxon countries, score so much higher. But look at their confidence level. It's much lower. And do they value the subjects? No, they don't. By the way, Singapore has changed a lot, actually, over the past several decades. It's quite fascinating to look at all those numbers. So on the one hand, the question you want to ask, you want scores, you want confidence. And more recent research about creativity said, oh, I want confidence. I want people said, I believe I can do it, especially when you're adults. So you are in society, you may not know much math, but if you need it and you believe you can learn it, it's probably easier to do than when you're younger, just getting the good grades. And then this kind of data, you look at the correlation. The TIMSS data, Tom Lovelace run the same data. Because Tom Lovelace, a lot of Americans, they say, oh, our students have low scores because they love the subjects too much. Doesn't it mean we need to make our kids hate the subjects so they can get scores up? What makes sense? So they have begun to dive into more of this international studies to say, what does it really mean behind it? So in the end, I want you to think about it. I wrote a book about this, but 2 years ago, published by the Teachers College Press. So what works may hurt. It basically means in education, you have so many different educational outcomes. If you pursue one, if a pedagogy or educational system makes one work well, it might hurt other indicators. So I've been looking at data, for example, PISA math scores and perceived entrepreneurial capability. It's all negative. It's all negative. That is, PISA scores have a negative correlation with entrepreneurship indicators. Means the higher the PISA scores of a country, the less entrepreneurial students become, and the less creative they become. Why is that? So that basically means that education system, when you are moving toward one goal, you might hurt other goals. And later on in big PISA, this is this year's PISA data. For example, it says a fear of failure is negatively correlated with average reading performance. That is, if a student is afraid of failure, and I'm sorry, is positively correlated with the reading, your test scores go higher. And you said, look at it, here's Hong Kong. Your students are afraid of failure, but they score high. They don't like it. Then, of course, PISA has another measure. They began, by the way, I have to claim this. They adopted because I've been critical of PISA for a long time to say, they said, okay, let's look at student well-being, students' life satisfaction. You saw this negative correlation. That is, students who have higher test scores, China, Hong Kong, Macau, have lower life satisfaction. Why is that? That is, so can these outcomes go together? Or maybe they cannot go together. So when people, in the US talk about social emotional learning or social emotional well-being, they want to teach a course. Let's teach students to have social emotional well-being. I said, don't teach that, because it's the teaching, the learning approach you're taking is hurting the students. When you're trying to teach social emotional learning, you're hurting them more. You're not helping them. And instead, so you need to change the educational outcomes. And then, of course, there's other things that I've tracked down in my data. To say, we've been arguing for, we want students to be 4 C's. Collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and communication. And now Michael Fullen says we need to have 6 C's. So he would add character and content. English is a good language. You can have many, many C's. And I joked with Michael Fullen. I said, why don't you could be adding 8 C's. You add China and Canada. You can keep going with this. But the overall idea is people say, okay, we got the 4 C's. Everybody should have the 4 C's. But do the 4 C's really go together? What if someone is extremely, let's say, extremely collaborative and critical thinking, but they're not really good at creativity in the high end? Actually, they don't go together. You cannot possibly have everybody to be equally good or equally bad at the same time. You can't just say, okay, let's teach 4 C's. Then you will be 25% collaboration, 25%, critical thinking. You can't do that. Actually, human beings are different, like we said. The same thing, what if this model, students might work differently. So there's very different things to think about outcomes. When you have one approach, there's no one approach that serves all students, serves all educational outcomes. Another reason, actually, I'm not putting on the slides. In my book, I wrote about something called productive failures and productive failures, or successful or unproductive success. So like direct instruction, you teach somebody something, they can remember it now. That's very successful, better than inquiry-based learning. But that in terms of transfer of knowledge, if you measure about half a year later, the knowledge is gone. It's not very useful. So it's successful, but unproductive. They have other teaching methods that drives you to say, okay, the learning may be slower, but in the long run lasts longer. Now, but this diagram shows another model, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with now. In education, we like to have this kind of diagrams to say, oh, we got 0.5 correlation, very good. But look at this 3 students. Students from here, they're all in a negative domain. That is, these people are being hurt. It's like you have a vaccination or medicine. If the medicine kills 3 people but saved 7 people, is it good medicine? For the 7, yes. But for the 3, it's bad. What works may hurt. So what this idea is this: in schools, when you're teaching all these children, we have to keep in mind, schools serve many, many outcomes. We have short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes. Especially that's why I want teachers, educators to remember, most schools will watch for short-term outcomes. For example, because we have a course is 1 semester. Then if we're serious, we go to half a semester, we give a test. 1 week, we give a test. But in the long run, is that meaningful? For example, is it as important for students to remember how many presidents we have in the US? Or is it more important for them to keep a strong, positive attitude towards your history course? In teaching language, it's the same thing. I know in Hong Kong, you do bilingual. Is it important for the children to memorize all the words, the grammatical rules you should try to teach them in 1 semester, but then they began to hate the subject? They lose confidence in the subject. What matters? So we have instructional outcomes. We have educational outcomes. We have the cognitive outcomes. Is it important for you to remember how to do something? Or is it important for you to remember that you actually want to do it? You can do something versus you want to do something. Is it important for you to memorize all the knowledge? Or is it important for you to remember the curiosity? So that's the differences. Now in education, I've laid out 2 things now. Children, naturally born learners, diverse learners, intentional learners. I've also said in a traditional way of measurement in education, we do not measure all outcomes. We as educators, as parents, we have to make choices about outcomes. What matters to you? I know in Hong Kong, a lot of parents worry about what's my child getting? You know, in 1st grade, what their grades, 2nd grade, what their grades, even though we know in the long run, life is a marathon, but we worry about the short term, not long term. So now I'm going to present you another thing. Things have changed. So interesting book a while back published by 2 economists from Harvard, Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz. It's a fascinating book. It's an economist book. It talks about the race between education and technology. Their basic argument is that education runs against technology. Technology always advances. When technology moves forward and causes a big revolution, it redefines what we should learn. Education should try to catch up to that. And if education doesn't, we have a big problem. You know, I remember I was born in a Chinese village. This actually is quite interesting. I joke about this, which is kind of true. I should thank water buffaloes. When I was born in Sichuan, a little village, I was very bad at riding a water buffalo or doing any of my farming work. That's when my father said, why don't you go to school? So I'm glad I went to school because I was really bad at everything in the village. I was not good at village stuff either. Remember, that's in the 1970s I went to school. And there was no pathway towards college. Simply I was avoiding the countryside stuff. But luckily, society's changed. And then the farming skills other guys learned was not as important as what I learned. So that's the shifting of knowledge. So let's take a look at the new shifting of our society right now. We all know artificial intelligence, big data is coming. The 4th industrial revolution is coming. Automation is on the verge. I was reading a report from McKinsey in 2017. They predict 800 million jobs, 1/3 of the world's jobs will be shifted. Recent data from COVID says over 44% of jobs will be at home. All big changes, massive shifts. And now what's the big change? That's artificial intelligence. You look at artificial intelligence, this is actually quite fascinating. This is from a study of the Brookings Institute. The Brookings basically analyze the data to say, they look at patents of artificial intelligence to say what kind of jobs the patent application says the artificial intelligence will do. Then they analyze the data in the labor statistics. What kind of jobs or tasks are being done by people? Then I did the comparison. So you can see this very clearly. The biggest impact of artificial intelligence will not be on less than high school, or some college. It will be on bachelor's degrees and graduate programs. This is quite shocking because previous automations have replaced jobs of high school people, some college, not affecting college graduates. I know a lot of people who listen today who are in the audience probably are thinking about going to college. I mean, you have children going to college, going to graduate degree, but that's where this biggest impact will be. And that impact is going to be, look at female, Asian Americans will be affected among most because we hold some of the high paid, highly educated jobs. Accounting, that's one of them. Banking, that's another one, the medicine, that's all these jobs. So what's happening now is basically what's patent jobs, mechanical jobs, predictable jobs. Like for example, if you read in medical, if you read X-rays, those kind of jobs are probably going to be reduced and changed. So what the future society will need is basically we're going to have millions and millions kind of jobs, but each job will only require a few people. That's what the future will be actually. So because before we used to have a fewer jobs, but jobs require millions of people. The future will be a big shift. So in essence, what the future will be needing is creative, entrepreneurial, and globally minded individuals who are diverse and unique and social and emotionally healthy. I want to emphasize diverse and unique. That's where our future will be. Remember I said when our children come in, they are already diverse, they are already unique, they are intentional. And if they're intentional, they're naturally creative, and we need them to become more entrepreneurial. So this comes to say, okay, our education in the future is about supporting individuals to have a great talent. This is a wonderful book. How do you create talent? It's basically the 3 T's. And basically you have to have a natural born talent. That's why I never try to play soccer or football. I'm going to be killed on the football field. I'm trying to find where I have talent. Then you need to spend time. We joke about 10,000 hours is a good time. Well, 9,000 hours might work. You just need to spend time on that talent. Then good teaching. Good teaching is multiple variations, lots of experiences. So there's 3 T's. So try to find out what you're good at, spend time on that, become unique and talented. That's where you need to be. But that's also only think about employability, that you will create the jobs. You don't look for jobs, you create jobs. But you need to think about happiness. So this is another part of it. In the 21st century, we want people to be happy. How do you make them to be happy? Well, happiness comes from Maslow's talk. A musician must make music, artist must paint, poet must write. This is if you want to be ultimately at peace with yourself. What a man can be, he must be. This is called self-actualization. This line of research is carried on by positive psychologists like Martin Seligman talk about use your signature strength and virtues in the service of something much larger than you are. So that's the creativity piece. Can you create value for other people using your strength? So here's what I come up with the book. What the future needs. Can you help each child to become unique and great. And everybody can be great because that person is unique. You have nobody to compare to. You know, if you are good at something, you cannot be a second person. Have you noticed nowadays, you know, people trying to mimic in some movie stars, it never work because you have one unique person to become unique and great. And you find something you're passionate about or you're good at. And then you, through entrepreneurial, creative skills, talents, you create something valuable for other people. That is the future of education can be. So what the future of education could be like, I just made this is my new book. I just finished this one book. My one book is called Learners Without Borders. It's coming up next year. So I had to just imagine, what if we have a curriculum like this? You got 30% of a national curriculum, which transmits the most basic requirements of our nations. I call that floor expectations. That is the social values, cultural values, literacy, and numeracy. They have a school mandated curriculum. That every school represents a local community, a group of parents. So if the national curriculum is 30%, local schools 30%, then you got 40% personal. That makes you successful. This national curriculum school mandate makes you a person to live in a society. What makes you individual and different is the personal curriculum. So that is what I think, you know, you can be. I've documented a lot of schools for doing what I describe in a book that's published actually before the COVID crisis. If you get a chance, you can read this. In this book, we documented individual students are making the fight to be individuals. Teachers are creating opportunities. Schools are doing this, and groups of schools are making similar things. But in the end, I want to emphasize one more thing. The whole idea came from a book I just wrote with Michael Wingmeyer. We just published this, actually. This is from ASCD. We focus on, you want students to be self-determined learners. That means they are the owners of their own learning. They own their own learning. They come to school, school serve them. They will be driven by their interest, by their talent, and they work with schools to make that happen. So this is how we want our students to be successful in the future. So I hope that helps to say self-determined learners, individuals, diversity, and they are going to become creative and entrepreneurial. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhao, for your inspiring lecture. It's now time for the Q&A session. Please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can read them out for you. The raise hand function will not be responded.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that provocative talk. And just this idea of 40%, which is not even half, right? 40% of a child's education being made up of personal choice in some sense is probably very, very scary to everyone, teachers, but also learners, because I think that we're not accustomed as learners to having a lot of choice in our learning. So I have lots of questions, but I see lots of them in the chat box as well. So let me just start with a couple, and then we can have some sort of back and forth. So here's a question from Kate Searson, and she asks, in a practical sense, how does personalizable education combine with the need to have a functional level of literacy and numeracy? So this, you know, in some sense, the floor that you were talking about, how do those things come together? And she also talks about the fact that you say you're bad at maths, but you have enough maths to analyze statistics. So obviously you're not as bad as some of us may feel we are. So what level of literacy and numeracy do you think students need before they can branch off? And maybe I'll add to that question. Is it a one comes before the other? but you have to have the foundation first before.
Thank you. That's a question. As I've paid the person ask the question, I was so happy that someone asked that question. First of all, let me actually say a little bit about my math. I was really bad at math. Seriously, why I choose to learn English is because if I choose to study English to pass the college entrance exam in 1982 in China, you don't have to take the math test. So math did not count as a total score. I avoided that. And how bad I was? I got a 3 out of 100. If you know math, that's pretty bad. Okay, 3 out of 100. I can tell you another person who got a 3 out of 100 is called Jack Ma. Jack Ma, when we had a conversation together, we actually was joking about this, is that he had a 3 out of 100. Then he repeated next year, he got over 30, and he repeated another year or some 70. So I choose to study English. He studied English to be English teacher as well. So I'm actually, he got a 1, I think 1, but he was not as good as I am. But he run a big company, and I guess so. It is English that helped Alibaba. And now the basic literacy and numeracy. Of course, I think. If normal people, ordinary people should all have the basic literacy and numeracy. But when we say basic, how basic that is, actually was looking at the data. Lynn, actually, you're very familiar with this. In America, people talk about if you cannot read by 3rd grade, your chance of going to jail is much higher than others. You've seen that data, right? But they actually look at the data further and say, yes, the data is like that. What does it mean? It basically means, all those people who could not read by 3rd grade, we basically did not know how to teach them in 4th grade. We could not compensate them. If you're immigrants, you come in like 16, if you still know how to teach them, they're still successful. Another thing is that the children who cannot read by 3rd grade normally come from poor families, So that's many other kind of factors involved. But I would like to say this. We should have literacy and numeracy courses, but they probably should be more following the child. In the US, I cannot say anything about other countries, but in the US, No Child Left Behind did not improve much, but they focused on numeracy and literacy. They had a lot of remediation. They've widened the opportunity gap. So I think literacy and numeracy are required, but they should be done quite differently. And if you want to learn how to do it, ask Lynn Goodwin. She knows how to do that. Okay, but that is, we know. I used to be with the National Reading Center at Michigan State University. We know there are many different ways to do this than the traditional way. So you ask which comes first. I think really it depends on the child. If a child comes to school who cannot read and has no reading interest, I would not force that person to read. I would not. I would try to engage this child first. So I wrote about this, this achievement gap, is that you always start with where the child is, and you do strength-based. Every child should feel good. They want to engage with the schools. Another thing I want to point out is that, Lynn, you were saying that, yes, 40% is quite scary. I just pointed out, actually, I'm piloting with the schools. We're doing 10% for students to choose. But one important thing is that in the models we're piloting, we'll always make sure children, A, they can teach other students if they want to. B, they can learn from community. C, they can from online books, online website, and others. There are systems to organize to support that.
Great. Thank you so much. Oh boy, I'm in the unfortunate position of trying to pick questions. So I'm going to pick one through self-interest coming from Singapore. So there's a viewer who'd like to know, in the stats about confidence, sort of the inverse relationship between high scores and confidence. Singapore has made some changes and demonstrated, some differences. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what have they done?
Yeah, I know. Well, you know this very well. That Singapore has, since 1990s, actually has done a lot of changes, despite of their high scores on the TIMSS and on the PISA. And Singapore has, I think, seen a lot of teachers do PD. I've been involved in a lot of this professional development, changing the view of schooling. And also, I think Singapore has done a lot in terms of their national task forces on technology, on making different changes. So I think pedagogically, Singapore has changed a lot. And I haven't been there, recently. I was just giving a talk recently, but I have not been there. I think Singapore has changed, and the change is mostly in the classroom.
I agree. I remember going to Singapore and bringing a colleague, and this was before I came to Hong Kong U. So it was his first time going to Singapore, and we went to visit a school. And it was a quote ordinary school. It was not one of the elite schools. It wasn't, the school. It wasn't Raffles. And I remember my colleague going around and he kept asking me the same, looking around, kept asking the same question. So are kids tested in order to get to this school? No, they're not tested. Oh, okay. 20 minutes later, are you sure? I mean, maybe they're not tested, but there are other entrance requirements? No, there are no entrance requirements. So this is not a special school of some kind for, extra talented kids. And no, it's not. And he just couldn't sort of get over the fact that the school was well-resourced. It was a nice place. Kids are happy and engaged. And it really sort of helped me look at the Singapore system through the eyes of someone for which it was unfamiliar. So going back to the chat box, there are several questions sort of in the same veins. I'm going to try and connect them. And it's about outcomes, outcomes-based, measurement, and all this talk of personalizable and personalized education. So if we're going to focus on social emotional learning and well-being, and I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask the question, how do we measure these things? And, how do we sort of manage, or respond to diversity in a context that is very sort of outcomes driven?
Well, first of all, I think my preferred assessment is student profiles. I like to do profiling of students, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, what they've learned, what they have not learned. You still have standards. You can still have a lot of standards in a lot of subjects. Students can choose or not to choose. There's in America, there's a new movement. It's called Mastery Transcript Consortium. Mastery Transcript Consortium. That started about 3 years ago. It started by a group of elite private schools. Now they've included nearly over 200 public schools now, public and private. So they are creating a profile for each student. The student can highlight what they've done, what competencies they have, and they've been using that for American private, actually quite elite universities. They've submitted the first transcript last year. It's been, I think, doing well. That's a different model. You do a transcript model. So right now you do a GPA or test score. If you give me a GPA of 3.5, I really don't know who you are. I don't know, because you could, sometimes we say, okay, we joke about this. Let's just imagine two subjects. One person is 100% in English and 0 in math. Another is 100% in math, 0 in English. You still get a 50. It doesn't give me anything. But if you're looking for, if you're going to study, that's a drama, that's a different set of skills than you want to study computer engineering. So you should have different, profiles of that. It's possible to do. You can do that. I think social emotional learning, all this right now, I'm actually I'm co-editing a AERA journal right now. Mm-hmm. It's called the RRE, the Review of Research in Education with Ron Bigetto. Mm-hmm. This issue, we're talking about creativity. And one of the things everyone says, okay, how do you measure creativity? So I'm just reading 134 proposals. So we got to select about 15 out of 134. So I'm just about halfway down. A lot of them deal with the creativity and deal with assessment. But really, how do you assess creativity, for example? Do you assess creativity potential like we used to do as Torrance divergent thinking? Are you able to think divergently? That doesn't predict Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. Or do you assess the final product, what you've created? Or do you assess the process? Like, for example, yeah, I can create, but I don't want to create. And so how do you drive me? So there's all kind of process. I know the desire for assessment, but it's extremely hard. Now, for example, PISA is trying to assess creativity. It's a mistake. It's not going to be able to do it, but they have made up one. And so you do this, you get a score, and you go back to your parents. Oh, we got a creativity score. It's a lie. It doesn't really work this way. The same thing with PISA. PISA just did a global competence. You know, global competence is done so different in different cultures. People want you to treat other countries differently. How can you have one thing? But anyway, that's a long way to say, I'm not a big fan of standardized assessment. But if you want to do it, make it the floor assessment that everybody needs to have as a floor to monitor a system, but do not apply to individuals. I'm writing an article about Australian assessment, the NAPLAN, the National Assessment of Literacy and Numeracy with Jim Waterston. So actually going through that, they said, okay, this assessment served 5 goals. Follow the country's national outcomes, improve the system, improve the school, inform the parents. I said, no, you can't do that. It's impossible to do that. Have one little test to do all of those things. I'm sure, Lynn, you know this very well. So student profiling, I think that's going to come. Digital student profiling, highlight strength, highlight success, doing portfolios, that will be very helpful.
So that actually, that sounds fantastic. And you're right. I mean, we connect, you know, grand results to very, very puny instruments or very, very puny activities. And then we believe it, which is the second part of the problem. But anyway, so here's a question about that's sort of connected to this idea of assessment. There are questions about young children and this whole notion of identifying and nurturing talent. And so there are several viewers who are wondering, well, how do we do this in early childhood classrooms? How do you go about sort of, quote, identifying talent? And I'm going to add a layer to that question. What about the developmental nature of learning? When I think about someone like my husband, for instance, who is a scientist, but learned late in life that he really enjoys economics and the stock market and what have you. But it was not, he said 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it would never have dawned on him that he would have been interested in that. So some things take time to develop.
Well, I think, you know, the first thing is that when young children, when we say strength-based, doesn't mean you lock them, does not mean you lock them in. Remember, human beings are intentional. Is if you need to find out what they're good at and start from there. Then they expand. You know, education, no matter how hard we try as teachers, children take control. In some way, that they will always try to find ways to do that. You know, they may cheat on you. They say, I'm not going to do this. You know, I'm going. You know, the brave ones fight against parents. The ones who the good work ethic kids follow you. You know, they might lose it. But young children, the big thing for me, what I've learned, is a lot of different educational experiences, which stimulates creativity, also stimulates what you are born with. Because, you know, if we, like I said before, I could have been a Justin Bieber, but I could never become one. Now I don't know what I could be. You know, in my little village, I was only able to read, and luckily I was able to read in many ways. So I think that the big thing is very broad. You know, well, if you look at America, in the US, where does creativity come from? A lot of garages, a lot of museums, a lot of field libraries. Schools don't do that. They have been exposed to a lot more examples. Recently, I was reading a big study out of Harvard and MIT. It's really studying about patents, about inventors. How do inventors become inventors? It was really fascinating. So they put all the invention data. They tracked really millions of people from different places. They found something really interesting. early exposure. You're in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, you all go do that. You're both exposed to that. You have more talents developed in that domain. That's how you drive that, And why people don't invent in, let's say, Miami, Florida. There's nobody there to invent to copy you. So that's the kind of things you develop. That's how cultures develop. So if you want children to have talent, creativity, curiosity, broaden experiences. And also nowadays we lived up to 90-year-old. Don't treat a year or two as wasted. There's no hurry. There's a lot of things, exposure, music, museums, talents, especially for poor kids. The poor kids are mostly deprived of those opportunities. In America, the same thing. If you look at classrooms, there may not be a huge difference. It's the other things. That's important.
So there's been a lot of, and this is my question, there's been a lot of conversation during this pandemic period about learning losses and about the widening gap between kids who are more privileged and those who are less so. And a question that I've had is, I wonder if some of this lost learning is actually meaningful. That kids actually ended up not learning things that were not worthwhile in the first place. Because we do teach a lot in school that is part of the standard curriculum, but really is not so meaningful. So what would you say to that in terms of this, the whole notion of what's worthwhile, lost learning, learning gaps, etc.?
There's so much to do. We debate about this a lot. But so first of all, I completely agree with you. Right now, the learning loss is talked about as measured as not learning what's been prescribed.
Yes.
So that's not necessarily meaningful. I've been working with a school in Hong Kong, Coral Bay School in Hong Kong, and I've talked. It's a English foundation school. So the teachers have talked a lot about how they're teaching better. They have to retreat from over teaching. So I think this idea of loss of learning has made a lot more teachers to become more aware of, said, okay, what is it necessary to teach? Then there's another thing, we should talk about not the loss, the gain of learning. After this, we've seen if school closed longer, some children have become more independent. They said, okay, I used to rely on the teacher to teach me. Now I realize I can learn. Children, it's very hard for them to be locked in at home doing nothing. They have to go do something. They've learned about independence. They've learned to become more resilient. They have developed a view about this virus and human life. They've developed more possibility to connecting with their families, because a lot of children, after age 6, they're not home much. Now they are now with parents. There's a lot of newly developed things. However, we should be clear about this. There are a lot of children who are living in very poor and bad homes. Their home environments don't necessarily help them. And those children may be suffering more. But so that's why this context is different. But I completely agree with you, Lane, is that if you only measure learning based on standards, based on curriculum, that's a bad idea. I don't believe after this 1 year or 2 years, our children are going to be much worse than previous generations. I don't think that's going to happen. That's, by the way, that shows about how, when I was talking about learning, we teachers treat so seriously. We can squeeze out of 20% of our time, go do something else. Our children will not be missing much you are not teaching them.
Thank you.
So I want to encourage our teachers to think like, what if you teach less than 20% of your time? Do 80-20 to say what happens. I doubt the students will lose much.
need to experiment, right?
Go ahead,
Speaking
Lee.
of taking some risks.
Yeah.
So I'm just aware of the time, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about silver lining for learning, because I know that you have been engaged in some fascinating conversations and learned a great deal. So just wondering if you could share a couple of highlights where you said, wow, I can't believe folks are doing X.
Well, first of all, let me say, yeah, you're right. Thanks for so much. By the way, if people want to find it, it's called silverliningforlearning.org.
Mm-hmm.
And I just started, this is actually an interesting story to share with people. At the end of February, I was giving a keynote speech to the U.S. Independent School Association in Philadelphia. Remember that time? There was no problem in the U.S. because after that, I went to Spain. And after I come back to Spain, everything became a problem. So at that conference, I think it was February 28th, China was in lockdown, so was in Hong Kong. So at the end of my presentation, I said, well, let's imagine if the disease lasted more than 1 year, if schools were closed for more than a year, what reforms, what changes would we expect? So that was my thing. So I left and people were talking and people did not really pay attention to that. Then after that, come back in March, I said, well, it's really happening. So I contacted Chris Didi at Harvard, Punya Mishra at Arizona, Kurt Bunk at Indiana, and another Scott McCloud from Denver, all universities. Said, can we just do a show about silver lining? So as long as COVID, now it's been going on since March. So we began to do that. So what we've been doing, I think is really interesting, is we invite people from anywhere who has interesting ideas, as you said, or interesting practices that try to defy COVID lockdown. So we've had people from, let's say, Africa, from Italy, from Israel, from Turkey, all those places. So lessons I've learned. One of the most important lessons I learned, most fun, was several weeks ago. 2 teachers and 5 students, 10 to 13, 14-year-olds, 10-year-olds from Nepal. They've been learning English using MOOCs, massively online courses from different. And one students, they started learning from when they're age 10. And these 2 teachers were more organizing MOOCs to localize in Nepal. Remember, Nepal is a poor country, mountainous area. It's shocking. And these students speak good English, they learn. And so one student took like 40 courses, another took 26. Then they began to expand. One person took a course about dinosaurs. Then they began to go to history. That's actually what I was hoping all our course schools can do. You expand your thinking. Don't lock your students down. Introduce them to all the possibilities. Think about YouTube. Think about this. So legitimize learning from outside. That's what actually really struck me as something important. So I began to write that in my book. It's learning today is truly global. And then, of course, we've seen another one from Myanmar. We got a couple in Myanmar are doing, you wouldn't believe it, artificial intelligence-driven learning apps for students on the phone. Myanmar, that was just absolutely drove me crazy to say, oh God, all these changes. And then we learned from different countries, let's say in Australia, other places, there's a big shift into say, okay, how do you give students more time? If students are not in your room, why don't you give them the task, not give them the instruction? Maybe you don't need to teach them. Students can learn on their own when they are driven. So that is a lot of things. I hope people can watch it. It's on YouTube, Silver Lining for Learning, and that will be great.
It is great, and I recommend it highly. So, it's interesting when I think about the title of one of your books, where a good crisis is something that we shouldn't waste. And I was just reading a blog post by Andy Hargraves, and he was talking about sort of all the things that systems are likely to do but shouldn't, if they shouldn't do if they sort of want to go backwards in some sense. And so he said one thing that is already happening is that using the crisis, governments, policymakers, etc., can push through policies and reforms that very quickly in response, right, to the situation. And then what we might find ourselves in is a circumstance where a year or two from now, we're stuck with certain practices and policies that we agreed to in the moment. So what should we be, how can we be vigilant? How can we prevent that? How can we be thoughtful in a moment of crisis?
Well, I was actually with Andy on a bunch of things. Andy has, I think he has a view. There's a lot of people who have a strong view that the government can do a lot. And they believe a system should lead the change, should drive this. Honestly, I've lost faith in systems leading changes. Systems can only lead changes when it's starting a revolution. But right now, I don't think any revolution exists. So what I'm focusing on is students. As I mentioned, students are our change partners. Students change, teacher change will be slow. And that's what an evolution is needed. We cannot dive in, a quick change. So most of the changes I advocate when I work with the schools is called building schools within a school. Like same thing, you lead the faculty of education. If you want to change, you cannot come in to fire everybody, redo it. You rely on the few people who will change with you, and you will try to lead the change in a much smaller pace. So I don't believe in government make big changes. Like, for example, I'm calling for the US. Since we've stopped standardized testing, why do you start again? Just stop it. If we shouldn't do it, if you look at the data, the testing has done bad for a lot of people, Australia, a lot of places. Then why do you want to restart it? It will be restarted, I'm sure, actually, but why should you? If a system cannot even do that? And also another thing is that I predict a future, but that future could be wrong. So I'm always careful about technology changes can have very strange spins. So I would like to say systems do not take systematic approaches. They retreat from over-governing. You allow on the ground innovations. People as grassroots, we drive innovations, we lead, but we need government to retreat. When I wrote the book about China, why China has the best and worst, Chinese economic development did not benefiting from any direct efforts to do something, but rather the government retreating from doing something. So that's actually the changes. Very interesting happening if you look at the whole thing. We did not tell peasants how to farm. Then the farming gets better. So that's really how it happens. So I'm interested in governments retreating from over-governing and trust the individuals, grassroots to make the movement. University of Hong Kong, like under your leadership, if you have creative students graduating from your school, they will gradually lead the change. And so the change will somehow happen in different ways. I'm a Taoist, okay. A Taoist is just, as Taoist, you basically said, wu wei er zi, that means you do something without over-governing.
I agree with you. And I just worry, that when there's a threat, it becomes easy for governments or systems to say, we must hurry up and do X. Otherwise, everything will fall apart. And in those moments, it is sometimes difficult to be thoughtful. So your last point made me think about the fact that there are lots of things that we know are not good to do. And there are lots of things where we have plenty of evidence that they're harmful, like standardized high stakes testing, but we still persist in doing them. And I want to connect this notion of, sort of norms to students as partners, because engaging students as partners means giving up power and adults taking risks. How do we do that? Can we do that?
Well, we'll say we all have to take the beautiful risk. That's not a line from me. That's a line from Ron Bigetto. Yesterday, when I was teaching, I had him in my class. He's a creativity expert. We all have to take the courage to take the beautiful risk. I don't see a future. I don't see us strengthening the traditional system. If we continue to strengthen, we will lose. So let me actually say this. When I was reading the book by Claudia Golden about race between technology and education, I was basically thinking, this is about 2007 book. It's 10 years now. It's our society would get in trouble like we did. Basically, look at today, with or without COVID, international geopolitics, the rise of Trump, the rise of strong men in politics is all a result of social unrest. The social unrest comes from the disappearance of the middle class. The middle class disappeared. The income gap has widening, since 1970s. It's because education hasn't caught up with technology. If you look at technology since 1990s, basically we have benefited all the bankers, the investors. We've benefited all the technology people. Those who cannot catch up has lost. So we had needed a new education since the 1980s, but we've been trying to solve the 1950s problem, the Lyndon Johnson problem. We've been solving the old problem. So we've been wasted by a nation at risk. 1983, we've been wasting our time. So what we actually need is a new education. Without honesty, I'm very worried without a new education to help the majority of the people to develop the new skills and knowledge, which has been called the 21st century skills, which was really published around 2000. We will be in big trouble. I'm very afraid of the social unrest. You look at the conflict between, honestly, Hong Kong and mainland China, China with the other countries. All this has to do with an education problem. If we remember before Obama's time, we had a good time. Everybody was loving each other. We were giving people 10-year visas. We were just traveling. We're doing all these wonderful things. It's just a few years. These few years have changed, not only with domestic discontent and global social unrest. I'm very concerned. So education has to change, has to move forward. And to this youth, to these children, are different from children 20 years ago. They have a phone. They have access to the world. They are learning. They're doing different things. So education, we need to move. If next time I come to Hong Kong, I hope we can talk about changing your initial teacher licensure. Teachers have to take different goals, different outcomes, but the accreditation bodies, they're not changing. Someone has to change in private.
Right.
We, for the sake of humanity, really, for the sake of human beings, really have to change. In the next 5 to 10 years, we know jobs are shifting. Things are changing. We have to make that shift.
It makes me think of a very, very good friend of mine who is probably at this point in her 35th or 36th year of teaching 4- and 5-year-olds. One thing that she is fond of saying is, because people say to her, what do you do with those babies? You just kind of play all day. And, anyone who is smart knows that the younger you go in terms of teaching, the more difficult, the more complex the work is. And she says, children, no matter how young they are, she calls it the world stew. They are in the world stew. They are watching, they are listening, they are taking things in. And this was a few years ago when, we had this conversation. Now, as you said, kids are wired. They're connected to the universe. They are part of it all, and they need thoughtful adults to help them make sense of it. And I don't think, have been doing a good job with that. So
Thoughtful, I love it, Lynn. I want to just comment on your thoughtful, that thoughtful adults. I just think people in education needs to be thoughtful human educators, not teaching machines.
Yeah, here. So in the 5 minutes that we have left, you've talked about big grand visions, and I'm imagining someone who's a teacher in a classroom, whether it's a university classroom or a K-12 classroom, someone who's preparing to be a teacher, someone who's a parent, someone thinking, okay, I buy this. What's one small difference I could make in the way I think or in my practice tomorrow or what have you? What might you suggest to us?
I suggest you go back, look at your students as individual human beings. As to say, are you helping each and everybody connected to their strength and passion, or at least give them some time to explore? That's really the most important. I think we have been looking at subjects for too long. And you and I may be different. Than, in the US universities, we teach graduate students. We can always change what we want to teach.
Right.
We can just, but in Hong Kong and maybe mainland China, other places, we've been looking at the curriculum. We've been looking at what we're supposed to teach. We're not looking at who we teach. After all, education is to help other people grow. Really other people grow. A lot of things we teach is an experience to enable students to construct themselves, to infuse themselves. It's not really about the specific knowledge, specific piece. If you're in a constructivist mode, nobody really learns anything just by memorizing what you say. That's just the worst type of learning. You create a possibility for them to exercise their hypothesis, to form themselves. But human educators, we're human beings. If you want to learn something, how to do something, watch a YouTube. They don't need you. I think look at a student as a human being.
That's a beautiful way to end a really inspiring talk. Thank you, everyone, for, it's really unfortunate that you're not here because, first of all, there would be thunderous applause from the huge group of people who have come to listen to you. And then we could go to a lovely dinner or lunch or something and talk further. And it's unfortunate that our students also don't have the chance to spend some sort of more intimate time with you. But we really do appreciate your time with us today. You've given us a lot to think about. Professor Zhao has kindly agreed to do something with us in the spring. We're still formulating that, but hopefully it'll be sort of more dialogic and will enable us to hear more about your thinking. Do sign in to Silver Lining for Learning because there is a great deal to learn. Just a last sentence from you before we say goodbye.
I want to thank you. Thank you very much. And thank everybody because this is a very enjoyable conversation. I really am glad that we had this conversation. Thank you so much with best wishes.
Thank you so much. And yes, best wishes to all of us. And hopefully things will improve in the US. Thank you, everyone. Crystal, do you have do you close us out?
Yeah, I will.
All right, okay,
Thank
great.
you, Professor Goodwin and Professor Zhao for the intellectual dialogue. So I think our time's almost up. So if you have any questions, you can write to Professor Zhao at yongzhaoeducation@gmail.com. The email address is also shown on the screen right now. So that's the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your participation. We look forward to seeing you in our future events, whether online or in person. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
And thank you, Yong, for agreeing to take, because there are so many questions in the chat box. I just didn't have enough time. We didn't have enough time for all of them. So you'll probably be a little busy for a while. So thank you for your generosity. And have yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day and have a good evening. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.